Think about the last time you finished a book or a TV series and felt different. Maybe you were pacing around your room, arguing with a character's choice, or feeling a strange sense of grief for someone who doesn't even exist. We usually call this escapism. We tell ourselves we're just taking a break from reality. But what if I told you that while you're escaping, your brain is actually doing some of its most intense work? What if stories aren't just luxury items for our downtime, but are actually the fundamental infrastructure of how we understand right and wrong? Today, we're diving into a massive research report titled The Unseen Architects. We're going to explore how fiction functions as a sophisticated moral laboratory. From ancient myths to Reddit fan threads, we're going to see how narrative doesn't just reflect our values, it actively builds the ethical scaffolding for our entire lives. So, how does this work? To understand it, we have to look at the difference between traditional philosophy and narrative ethics. Traditional philosophy, think of the big names like Kant or Mill, usually deals in abstract principles and universal rules. It asks, is lying always wrong, or what is the greatest good for the greatest number? But let's be real. In the heat of a real-life crisis, most of us aren't reciting categorical imperatives. Narrative ethics is different. It doesn't care about abstract impartiality. It cares about context, relationships, and the messy details of a specific human life. When you read a story, you aren't evaluating a math problem. You are wrestling with a particular person in specific circumstances facing real consequences. This is what scholars call moral imagination. It's our capacity to envision alternative worlds and feel the weight of a choice before we ever have to make it in the real world. Fiction is a low-stakes laboratory where we can rehearse reality. Have you ever had an aha moment where a fictional dilemma suddenly made a real-world problem click for you? That's the unseen architect at work. Let's get into the specifics. Why is speculative fiction stuff like sci-fi and dystopias so popular right now? It's because we are living in an era of future shock. Technologies like AI and massive surveillance are moving faster than our laws can keep up with. Take a show like Black Mirror. It isn't just trying to scare you, it's an ethical laboratory. By showing us the human consequences of technology, how it affects our relationships and our vulnerabilities, it lets us rehearse our responses to these futures before they actually happen. You don't just agree that surveillance is bad, you feel the stakes through the character's eyes. Then you have what researchers call empathy engines. Look at the movie Arrival. When we encounter a radical other, like an alien intelligence, the story forces us to rethink what we owe to someone who is completely different from us. This isn't just about aliens, though. It's training for a real world where we have to communicate across radical differences in culture or even interact with artificial intelligences. And we can't talk about sci-fi without talking about superheroes. Modern shows like Invincible have moved past the old Superman trope. They ask the hard questions: how does power corrupt? What happens when those with the most authority have no accountability? Instead of a lecture on power and responsibility, we watch a character's moral degradation. We see the rippling effects of their choices on an entire community. It's a gut punch that sticks with you longer than any essay ever could. But what about the stuff we were forced to read in high school? Does that still matter? The report argues that literary legacies, like To Kill a Mockingbird, have an incredible staying power because they refuse to simplify morality. Harper Lee didn't just write a book saying prejudice is bad. She embedded that question in a community where prejudice was normal. She showed that moral courage isn't just a heroic moment, it's acting against your own social circle. For millions, this book didn't just provide information about justice, it created an emotional commitment to it. And it's the complexity that makes it work. The best stories, from Moby Dick to Crime and Punishment, challenge us with sympathetic antagonists. They force us to hold multiple moral perspectives at once. In a world that wants us to collapse everything into good versus evil, literature is one of the few places that insists on moral ambiguity. It acts as a societal mirror, reflecting our values back at us and asking, are you sure this is right? Now, here is where things get really interesting. In the past, you read a book alone, and that was it. But today, we have the Digital Agora. Fan communities have transformed moral interpretation into a collective team sport. We don't just consume a story, we debate it. We cite textual evidence, build counterarguments about character choices, and collectively decide what a narrative means. Think about a character who does something controversial. On one side of the internet, they're a tragic hero. On the other, they're a cautionary tale. This isn't toxic discourse. Well, not always. It's actually moral pluralism in action. These debates model how we should handle disagreement in the real world through evidence, perspective taking, and trying to understand why someone else sees a hero where we see a villain. And don't sleep on fanfiction. Fan authors are essentially doing ethical experimentation. They ask, what if this character made a different choice? Or what if we saw this story through the eyes of a marginalized character? This is narrative repair. It's a way for communities to take the raw material of a story and rewrite the ethics to better fit our evolving world. And the creators are listening. We now have a bidirectional relationship where fans and creators are constantly negotiating the moral trajectory of our favorite worlds. Okay, so we've seen what fiction does. But how does it actually get inside our heads? Psychologists have identified a few key mechanisms. Narrative transportation. This is that flow state where you're so immersed in a story that the boundary between the fictional and the real becomes thin. In this state, the moral lessons of the story become incredibly salient and memorable. Emotional resonance. We remember a character's struggle far longer than we remember a philosophical argument. Perspective taking. Stories allow us to inhabit different genders, cultures, and even species. Research shows this is directly linked to increased empathy in the real world. Consequence visualization. We get to see the ripples of a choice across an entire fictional world before we have to deal with those ripples in our own lives. But, and there is a big but, this isn't magic. Stories can also reinforce our confirmation bias. We often interpret a character's ambiguous actions in a way that proves we were already right. And let's be honest, not all fiction is deep. Sometimes it's just passive entertainment that doesn't ask us to think at all. So, where does this leave us? The stories we're watching and reading right now are the scaffolding for the next generation's moral lives. Because our world is changing so fast with AI, climate change, and deep political polarization, fiction is often the only common ground we have left. The report calls for us to develop narrative moral literacy. This means moving from passive consumer to active architect. Ask yourself, what values is this show assuming are natural? Whose voice is missing? What moral world is this story trying to build? Because stories are never neutral. They are the most sophisticated moral technology we've ever invented. And once you see the unseen architects at work, you realize you have a choice in which buildings you want to live in. So, I want to hear from you. What's the one book, movie, or game that fundamentally changed how you think about right and wrong? Let's start a collective moral interpretation in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that make us human. I'll see you in the next one.